This week on the Storycraft Society, we're going to be talking about how I took my Dungeons & Dragons world and turned it from this into this. And it's a journey that I wouldn't trade for absolutely anything. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. My name is Garmin. This, of course, is the Storycraft Society, and recently I've been getting a few private messages and comments about my world map. The journey that I had to go from where the map started to where it is now, I think is a really impactful part of the last 5 years of my life, and I think that there's a lot of GMs out there and players and anybody who would be interested in the process of world building to see how a map goes from 0 to 100. It's really interesting to say that because I don't even think that the current iteration of my world map is the final one. It's just the one that's had the most attention given to it. That's an important part of this video, but just to be clear, the map right now looks like this. But it didn't start like this. It didn't start like this at all. And it didn't start like this. And it didn't even start like this. It started like this. And that's the journey that I want to take you on today. So a really good place for me to start talking about this is honestly just to tell you the story about how I ended up creating a world map at all. So when I first started playing D&D, I ran a game for my friends set in a very small area of my world map. It's in a place called the Valley of the Fa'ael. At that point, it was called the Delvenshire Valley. The players did stuff that affected it and changed the name, but all of that happened in a very tiny little bubble. By the end of that particular campaign, it only went from level 1 to level 6. The players ended up going down to a city, so I had to add a city somewhere off to the south, and that's where I came up with the capital city of Marindance. And then from there, I didn't do any more work to the world. Then when I was playing at Adventurers League at a local game store, the table of people that I was playing with who was playing more, rules as written official gameplay said that they wanted to start a homebrew game. When they said, "Who wants to DM?" I raised my hand. It was one of those things where I like running. That's my favorite part of the game. And so I was excited to get to run for my friends at the game store. When they saw how excited I was to run, they said, "Awesome." And their very first question was, "What setting are we going to be running in?" That's when I did one of these. My world. They, of course, responded, "Oh, what's your world called?" And I said, Tracina. They said, "Awesome." We set the first session up for a Friday night that was 2 weeks from then, and that gave me 2 weeks to build my world. I literally sat down the next day with a piece of sketch paper and started sketching out the outline of my world. And this is, I think, the core idea of this video through and through and through. What I did was absolutely nothing special. You can do it too. All you have to do is say, "I'm going to start drawing cool shapes until I like what it looks like. I'm going to throw some names on there that I think up on the spot," and then you'll be able to fill that out later with the help of your players and running games in it. Actually, to prove this point, I pulled out a sheet of paper and I drew a map exactly the same way that I made my very first Tracina map. It took me 20 minutes, and I went from having no continent at all to the land of New Worldia. Very original name. And the reality is that now it's ready to be played in. Why? Because it's a fantasy world. We get to talk to our players and they can help us flesh out the different regions. We can start adding things from different modules that we read or books that we want to put in this world. It doesn't have to be perfect, and every inch of it doesn't have to be scaled out. Just make something and then you have it and you're ready to go. Now I have something that I can slide in front of my players and say, "This is the world that we're playing in." And I'll tell you the truth. When I showed them my very first Tracina map, my players never scoffed and went, "This is in colored pencil." They were excited to play in a new world and see the new things and the rules that that world creates for them. Your first map is just a sketch. Get something down that you like, and you'll be able to edit that forever and ever and ever as you're running games. Now, the next chapters of my journey in making my world map more official comes down to 3 points. The first one is the more you play in the world, the more you can edit it. The second is that the more you edit, the more real the world will feel. And finally, it is never the final copy. You can keep telling yourself that over and over and over again in your head. When you sketch something out in colored pencil, it is not the final copy. So that's exactly what I did. About this point in my journey, I discovered Incarnate. Now, when I found Incarnate, it was a lot smaller of a program than it is now. The features in it were a lot more restrictive, but I ended up with this map. And I'll tell you what, I'll never forget the day that I slid that map onto the table in front of my players and watched them just absolutely glow with excitement. They were so unbelievably stoked to see that map, and I was so proud to show it off. I'll tell you now, with the journey that my Tracina maps have gone through, I'm not excited about that Incarnate map anymore, but I am still super excited about the feeling that I got when I showed that to my table for the first time. That's the thing, working on a map maker like Incarnate, I've watched it grow over the years. It's gotten way more complex than what I was dealing with way back then, but the reality is that that Incarnate map held me for another few years of gameplay. There were still regions of that map that I had no idea what was there. For a long time, I had no idea what was down here on the southeast coast, what was up in the northwest kind of area here, northwest of the Witchwood. I had no idea what was in this area that was kind of north of the Scorched Grass and west of the Emerald Plain. I didn't have any idea what was in those pockets, but it doesn't matter because there was never a point that my players were like, what's there? And when I said, I'm not sure yet, they got mad at me or something. That's just absolutely not going to happen. But then after a couple years of running with this Incarnate map, I even started to have some issues with it. So by this point, the number one issue I was having with my Incarnate map is that I really believed in the world. I believed in the world enough that I felt like it stood up and was as good as any other world that I had played in. That's how you want to feel about your world, that you're excited about it and believe in it. But my problem is when I would set it up against other world maps, I felt like mine looked, well, empty, first of all, but also it just didn't look like a real place. It just keeps coming back to the idea of this is never your final copy. And when I started looking at the Incarnate copy, I realized that there was a bunch of little things that just didn't make sense. Circles of mountains. Those don't really happen in the real world, and a lot of really well-made fantasy maps live up to those kinds of rules. I then started to re-sketch out the idea of what Tracina would look like. And that's when I ended up with this one. I looked at Incarnate. Incarnate was getting more complex, but I also had started crafting a lot more as a DM. So I wanted to go about attempting to make by hand a 3D version of the map that I saw in my head. That was something that took me a long time. From the very start of it to the end of it, it was something that I really put my heart and soul into. I started thinking about things like, if there's tectonic plates, that's what makes mountains. So ideally there would be tectonic plates in my world. Where do they make the mountain ranges happen and why? And then what's the result of that? Those kinds of things helped me to make the world feel like a more real place. Well, there was a point where I thought, this is the final. This is it. This is the map that I will make of Tracina. I was wrong, but I thought it. And the reality is that I started running all of my games in my game room off of this map. But then some issues started to arise. And they might be silly issues, but they were issues. The number one was, it was really hard to give my players a copy of the map. I could send them a photo of the one that I made, but that's different than having a paper map in hand that they can look at when they're at home. I also didn't put roads on this map. And again, this felt like it was the final copy of the map. It felt that way. I believed it, I really did. But the reality is that it still wasn't. So that's when I decided that I basically have done the best of what I can do. That's when I started reaching out to artists. I reached out to Daniel. You can check out his link in the description below, but he has a cartography business called Daniel's Maps. He's done a bunch of really, really cool maps, and when I reached out to him, I had a very specific idea of what I wanted the map to be. I wanted it to have a little bit of a Kingdom Come Deliverance flair to it, as well as a little bit of Witcher flair to it, and also I have a couple of nods to Matt Mercer's maps as well. But when I reached out to Daniel, it was such an awesome experience because when I sent him basically my pitch for what I needed him to do, I didn't hear back from him for about 2 weeks. And that was a little concerning on my part because I was like, well, maybe he's not interested in working with me or maybe my ideas aren't very good. But what ended up coming back was basically a mock-up of the idea that I had. Now, he did it in a section, I believe, of what's his homebrew world, but I was so blown away. And I was like, you nailed the exact style that I wanted in the map, something that I knew that I wouldn't be able to do as an artist. Fast forward a couple of months, and I was working with Daniel for about a month on my map. I was sending him all kinds of lore and descriptions of the areas, all of the maps that I've already created. I was answering his questions and telling him what revisions needed to be done to each draft until we finally ended up with this. This is the result of a journey of just years of gameplay, tons of games, tons of players who are giving me feedback and things that they'd like to see or characters that they need a home for. This is the result of just playing in a world for years. And I think that that's where the core moral, I guess, of my journey comes from. Too many GMs think that they don't want to make a world because they need every nook and cranny figured out from the very beginning, and that's just not true. When you look at my map of New Worldia, something that I created in 20 minutes, I mean, the Nortuptia Wastes, I don't know what makes them. Perhaps that was a site of where two very powerful mages battled years and years ago. Or maybe it's just barren waste because that's what the landscape is. What's number one? I mean, it's a city, obviously, but who lives there? Is it pirates? Is it a bunch of free folk that are trying to escape the more like lawful society of the Kingdom of Monte Corpus? The Kingdom of Monte Corruptus. See, these names are stuff that I just made up as I was writing letters down on a page. And that's what this started as. Alorn, Marindance, Greyspire, Rukdap. These are all names that I just said, that sounds cool. I'll figure out what's there later. With that said, I hope you enjoyed watching the journey that I've had through this map. I mean, it means just a lot to me. This world, I've spent a lot of time in it. Sometimes it feels like I've spent as much time in this world as I've spent in the real one. So I really enjoyed getting to share this all with you. And if you have any comments or thoughts, what you did with your worlds, let me know in the comments below. That goes such a long way, and I love the sense of community here on the Storycraft Society. But definitely like this video if you enjoyed it. Share this video with a friend that you think would enjoy it. That goes such a long way to helping a small YouTube channel out. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Other than that, get out there, draw some worlds. New Worldia awaits. I'll be seeing you.